This program is brought to you by Suffolk University. Please visit us on the web at www.suffolk.edu.
Good morning, and welcome to the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University. I hope you've had a chance to grab a cup of coffee as we embark upon the forum's first experiment in early morning conversation. My name is Wendy Ballinger, and I'm a member of the forum's board of directors. If this is the first time you've attended the Ford Hall Forum, you may not know that our history goes back more than a century. Well over 1,000 speakers have offered their thoughts from our podium. From Ayn Rand and Lester Thurow, from W.E.B. Du Bois to Malcolm X, and from Alice Walker to Al Gore. Each appeared free to the public, and each engaged in a dialogue with those who came to hear them. The forum can only continue to produce these events, though, with your support. Public contributions and personal memberships make up the bulk of our funding. If you're new to the forum, please consider joining this morning. You can learn more about membership at the table in the back of the room. We're also grateful to our partners, Suffolk University, the Lowell Institute, and the Massachusetts Cultural Council, along with other civic institutions, for their support. This event is being recorded and will be available as a webcast on the WGBH Forum Network. If you are sharing a comment or a question, please speak directly into the microphone so that you can be heard and so that your words can be captured for posterity. Please understand also that by asking a question or offering a comment today, you are giving the forum permission to record and to rebroadcast you. Also, if you haven't already, please take a moment to turn off any cell phones. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Robert Kutner, journalist, author, economist, and eminent public intellectual. Mr. Kutner is co-founder and co-editor of the American Prospect magazine, a senior fellow at the New York think tank Demos. He is a longtime columnist for Business Week, and he continues to write for the Huffington Post and the Boston Globe. He was a co-founder of the Economic Policy Institute, and he serves on its board. His magazine writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine and the Book Review, The Atlantic, The New Republic, The New Yorker, Dissent, Foreign Affairs, Columbia Journalism Review, and Harvard Business Review. He has contributed major articles to the New England Journal of Medicine as a national policy correspondent, and he continues to contribute columns to the New York Times International Edition. Mr. Kutner has served as national staff writer on the Washington Post, chief investigator of the U.S. Senate Banking Committee, economics editor of the New Republic, and assistant to the renowned journalist I.F. Stone. Educated at Oberlin College and the London School of Economics, and the University of California at Berkeley, he has taught at Brandeis, Boston University, the University of Massachusetts, and Harvard University's Institute of Politics. He is the author of 8 books, including the 2008 New York Times bestseller, Obama's Challenge, America's Economic Crisis and the Power of a Transformative Presidency. Bob's latest work is A Presidency in Peril, dealing with the financial crisis and the related political and regulatory battles of President Obama's first year. A fascinating and incisive look at both the promise that Barack Obama brought when assuming the mantle of the presidency and the factors that have served to tamp down that promise. Offering his unique perspective on the challenges that lie both behind and ahead of us, it is my pleasure to introduce Robert Kutner.
Well, thank you for that generous introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out early in the morning. Two favorite quotes keep running through my head as I think about Barack Obama and the situation that he faces and the situation that we face. One is by the poet Robert Frost, who said, "A liberal is the fellow who is so high-minded that he won't take his own side in an argument." The other is by the British historian A.J.P. Taylor. And Taylor wrote a book, did a lot of other research about the revolutionary year 1848. It was a year when peoples all over Central Europe who found themselves living in someone else's empire decided that they wanted national self-determination. They wanted their own country. They wanted countries that were both nationally self-conscious but also politically liberal. And for several months, revolutions broke out, and then every one of them was crushed. And Taylor wrote that it was a turning point of history on which history failed to turn. So, we shall soon learn whether the period 2008 to 2012 is one of those Roosevelt moments where history turned, or was it a turning point of history on which history failed to turn? And that's my subject this morning. Because what is unfolding before our eyes is partly the result of Obama's personal traits, his personal characteristics, his strengths, his weaknesses, what he brought to the presidency, and part, of course, is the result of the situation that he inherited, and not just the economic mess, but the political factors that make reform very difficult. I have been writing in the last week or so calling attention to the similarities between the oil blowout in the Gulf and the financial blowout, and I think they are several. One, people in finance and in the oil industry invented very complex technologies that they themselves did not fully understand, that when they broke did not have easy fixes and maybe did not have fixes at all. There was no worst case scenario that the wise guys who invented this stuff paid sufficient attention to. Secondly, the people on Wall Street who brought us all of this financial innovation that crashed the economy, and the people in the oil industry who brought us deep water drilling without adequate safeguards, invested massively in corrupting the political system of regulation. Because when you have something as central to the economy as finance, markets do not correct themselves. You cannot trust them to correct themselves. There's a line in the hedge fund industry, an expression, IBG, YBG. Anybody know what that stands for? It's a doozy. I'll be gone, you'll be gone. Let's sell this rotten security to some other sucker and let's get out of here. And that was the way the game was played. I don't know what the counterpart is in the oil industry, but I'm sure they have one. And in both cases, only government was competent to save the worst impulses of these industries from themselves. But government wasn't just asleep at the switch. Government was deliberately narcotized. The night watchman was bribed to turn the other way, and to some extent both parties were involved. I'm a progressive Democrat, but I would have to say that the deregulation really took off under Reagan, but then it got supercharged under the Clinton administration, where the Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party, as personified by Robert Rubin and his several protégés, persuaded Clinton that further deregulation of finance was in the national interest and would be good for the economy, and also would be good for the fundraising of the Clinton administration. And then it even got further supercharged under Bush. So, same story with the petroleum industry. You had the whole Cheney task force corrupting the Interior Department to the point where it was a revolving door. The oil companies could do pretty much what they wanted. And I think Obama was so preoccupied, with so many other issues that even 16 months into his administration, although he believes in regulation more than the Bush people did, he did not get around to cleaning house at the Interior Department. And of course, just a few weeks before the blowout, as part of a complex political bargain to try and get his energy bill through the Congress, he embraced drill, baby, drill. So the other thing that these two catastrophic crises have in common is that something that should have been a teachable moment, the collapse of Wall Street, the self-inflicted collapse of Wall Street, and the wider damage to the rest of the economy, and what is rapidly becoming the worst environmental catastrophe of all time, both of these should have been, could still be teachable moments for the proposition that the worst impulses of the private market need to be protected from themselves so the rest of us don't suffer. But the President has not quite risen to the occasion yet on either front. Now, why is this? And that's the subject of the book that is for sale out there, that I hope this talk will be intriguing enough that it will motivate you to buy the book. Let me take a poll. When Barack Obama became the Democratic candidate for president in 2008, and you all started paying closer and closer attention to the campaign, how many of you were really excited by the promise of this guy? And how many of you were rather disappointed with his first year? Okay, now I'm going to complicate the poll. How many think that his difficulty in gaining traction was primarily the result of structural forces somewhat beyond his control, the economic mess that he inherited, the filibuster rule, the determination of the Republican Party to block him at every course and destroy his presidency, versus how many of you think that a lot of his troubles were substantially the result of choices that he made that he might have made differently? Option A, structural forces. Option B, choices that he made that he didn't have to make. Both. Okay, that's our subject. So, in 2007, when I and a lot of other people started paying much closer attention to this remarkable young novice, I went out to Concord and I interviewed Doris Kearns Goodwin to do a piece for the American Prospect on transformational presidencies. Presidents who inherited crises, great crises, and turned them into opportunities for reform. Small list. On the liberal side, you'd have to say Lincoln, FDR, LBJ on civil rights before he got bogged down in Vietnam. On the conservative side, you'd say Ronald Reagan. What was it about these presidents that allowed them to turn crisis into opportunity and mobilize public opinion and not split the difference between the left and the right, but define a new center and move the center in the direction of the reforms that they wanted to pursue? What was it about the circumstances? What was it about the temperament of these leaders? What was it about the politics that they pursued? There's a line of John Maynard Keynes that I'm going to garble, but the essence of it is this, that if you think of public opinion as static, why do politics? I mean, by definition, public opinion is something malleable, often shallowly held, because most people don't pay attention to most issues most of the time, and leadership can make a tremendous difference. Also, by the way, social movements can make a tremendous difference. So Doris Goodwin and I had a wonderful talk. If you've ever heard her talk, you realize this is a woman who talks perfect prose. She speaks in complete sentences, and the challenge was not editing her, but the challenge was cutting 3 hours down to a manageable magazine piece. And I said to her, you know, this is so interesting because Barack Obama could be a transformational president. He's likely to inherit the worst economic crisis since the New Deal. He's got these amazing gifts, a capacity to speak to both sides of the spectrum, a sincerity, a decency, an honor, and a capacity to motivate people and make people believe that politics is an honorable enterprise again. You have to write a book on this. And she said, well, great idea, but I'm consumed doing my biography of Teddy Roosevelt. But if you write a book on this, I will suggest sources, and I will even read your manuscript. And I said, wow. So I set about writing the book that became Obama's Challenge, and it's dedicated to Doris Goodwin. And then I said to myself, how about a bit of a gamble? Why not make a wager that the economic crisis is going to get more serious, and that as a consequence of this, Obama's going to be elected? Let's get the book into print before the election. So I found a publisher who was as crazy as I was, and we said, we'll either have a bestseller or we'll have a bonfire. And the book came out in August of '08. And I wrote in that book that he had an opportunity to be the next Roosevelt, but if he didn't seize it, he would be the next Hoover. Because there were undertows, more than one undertow. There were all kinds of undertows of bad advice. There was the tremendous political influence of Wall Street, which, even though it had crashed the economy, was not just going to go away. There was a Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party. There was a Republican Party that was playing hardball. And there was the fact that he came to the presidency with less experience than any other chief executive, literally since Lincoln. The largest executive enterprise that Barack Obama had ever run was his own Senate office with a staff of about 40. And this man was becoming president of the United States. He'd also, until the 2008 campaign, never faced a difficult political campaign. I mean, he won his state Senate seat, he won the U.S. Senate seat when people suffered scandals. He had a token opponent in the general election when he won his Senate seat. So he was born lucky in a sense, but also you make your luck, and his whole history had been one of bridging difference, impressing people with his brilliance, his ease with other people, his capacity to forge a new consensus, and came on the scene as just a rock star. Well, what did he do once he was nominated? And the point where my heart started sinking was when he made his economic appointments. Because, as I said, the situation required a Roosevelt-scale break with the old regime. The old regime was a regime of deregulated finance that could invent anything, and the economists who supported this blessed innovations as, by definition, good. So if you create credit default swaps, you being Goldman Sachs, which are a form of insurance against a bond or a security going bad, because a hedge fund wants to bet against them, and then you sell them as if they were good investments to your other clients, and you make money both on the fees for originating them, and you also make some side bets. That is blessed as an innovation. Now, that violates the first rule of banking, which is that you have to hold reserves against losses. If you look at AIG, which was the company that went bust in a spectacular way that cost the taxpayers tens of billions of dollars and is still costing the taxpayers, AIG had no reserves against loss. Now, that violates the first rule of insurance. That violates the first rule of banking, that you hold reserves against losses, which then forces you to be more realistic in the way you size up risks. But the good people in Enron, enabled by both Republican appointees and Democratic appointees, Republican congresspeople and Democratic congresspeople, sneaked a law through Congress in the year 2000, stipulating that this could not be regulated either as insurance or as securities or as gambling. How about that? So that this whole set of games was beyond the reach of government regulation. So coming into office, Obama, first of all, had to contend with a whole business model that had grown up since the 70s, since the undoing gradually of the New Deal schema of financial regulation. And the business model was one in which banks really wanted to be hedge funds, taking in deposits, making loans, having a normal profit. That was boring. That was the way bankers operated in the 50s and 60s. The hedge fund guys could become billionaires overnight. And bankers wanted to be hedge funds. And with the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in 1999, bankers could become hedge funds. And the old New Deal rule that you were either a commercial bank that enjoyed access to advances from the Federal Reserve and certifications by bank examiners and federal deposit insurance, or you could be an investment bank and gamble with your own money. That division was collapsed. And you had super conglomerates, beginning with Citigroup and later every investment banker on Wall Street, doing both commercial banking with government-insured deposits and investment banking, which was gambling. And I won't go through the litany ranging from subprime to the corruption of the credit rating agencies, but it was a catastrophe waiting to happen, and it's not as if nobody noticed. I wrote a book about this in early '07. Nouriel Roubini wrote a book about it. There was a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve who issued Cassandra warnings about the dangers of subprime and the dangers of securitization. It wasn't that Joe Stiglitz warned about it, Krugman warned about it. It wasn't that nobody noticed. It's that the regulators were corrupted and that both parties were part of this. So Obama in April and May and June of 2008 realizes that he's going to be the nominee, and this is the period when the right is attacking him. Maybe he's a secret Muslim. Maybe he pals around with terrorists. There are these eruptions from his pastor, Jeremiah Wright. He's both a Muslim terrorist and he's a racist Christian, kind of a hard thing to be at the same time, but nonetheless. And also, there is the fair complaint that he's very inexperienced. So what do you do if you face those complaints? Well, you find the most blue-chip, reassuring, A-list economic team you could find. Now, there were people like Joseph Stiglitz and Nouriel Roubini and even the Republican chair of the FDIC, Sheila Bair, who had a very different view of how to reform the banking system. Their view was that the entire business model in which bankers try to be hedge funds needed to be undone, and we needed to return to something like the protections of the New Deal era so that the financial industry could go back to serving the real economy. But those aren't the folks who Obama appointed. Rather, he reached back into the Clinton era and appointed Larry Summers. And even apart from whatever sins Larry Summers committed as deregulator-in-chief under Bill Clinton, if anybody had bothered to take a close look at how he ran Harvard's endowment, you might have a little bit of pause before you put this man in charge of running the U.S. economy. But apparently nobody did. And then to complement the bridge to the Clinton-era deregulation, he appoints Tim Geithner, who is the bridge to the Bush-era deregulation. And then to frost the cake, he reappoints Ben Bernanke, who is an acolyte of Milton Friedman and believes in government assistance only after the fact, doesn't believe much in regulation as a preventive. So when these people, and then just to complete the quadrumvirate, he appoints Peter Orszag as head of management and budget. Orszag is a protege of Bob Rubin, and Orszag is of the belief that reducing the deficit is more important than the economic recovery, which is a subject I can go into at great length, but the one-liner is there are two ways to reduce the deficit. One, cut deficits during a period of economic collapse and balance the budget at a lower level of output. Two, have deficits in the short run and get tax revenues coming back in after you get a recovery going, and then get to budget balance at a higher level of output. Who thinks option two is a smarter way to get the budget back in order? Well, Obama is embracing option one. And as a consequence, it's harder for him to get his own program through Congress because the conservative Democrats and the Republicans are saying, gee, we'd like to pass this $23 billion bill so that 300,000 school teachers are not laid off in the middle of a recession, but Mr. President, that would increase the deficit. So we're not going to vote for it unless you come up with ways of paying for it, meaning you got to raise taxes or you got to cut some other program, which then cancels out the effect of the stimulus. So he is surrounded by people, I think, a little more conservative than he is, but I don't want them to take the fall because he's the guy who appointed them, but they reinforce his own conservative side. And then, of course, in addition to these structural factors, there is his own temperament. He is very much like the liberal described by Robert Frost in the quote. He has bent over backwards to try to find common ground with opponents who are pretty bent on destroying him. And this begins with a stimulus package. His own economic team, looking at the depth of the recession, argued that a 3-year stimulus ought to be about $1.4 trillion. That would be about 3 percentage points of GDP every year. But his political people felt that that was just too big. People would feel that it was simply too large, so they cut it back, and in order to get some Republican votes, they made a third of it in the form of tax cuts rather than direct spending, tax cuts being less stimulative than direct spending, and they were rewarded with 0 Republican votes in the House. And Obama expressed surprise that even when he was willing to compromise somewhat, he couldn't get much Republican support. Nonetheless, he spent his whole first 14 months trying to find common ground. And it was only when Scott Brown won the election in our fair Commonwealth that Obama started connecting with his inner partisan and started appreciating that if he was going to get anything done, he might have to do it as a Democrat. And for about 6 weeks after that election, on July 19th, he went to the Republican House caucus retreat in Baltimore. He then called a summit conference with the Republicans. Oh, geez, I turned this off. You know, they're everywhere. I hate these so much. All right, off. That's very funny. This is an object lesson to the audience. Don't ever do this. So it took him about 6 weeks, and Nancy Pelosi gets a lot of credit. He overruled people like Rahm Emanuel, who said, you know, Mr. President, settle for half a loaf, settle for a quarter of a loaf, do something so that you don't go down in flames. But he looking into the eye of a defeat, he decided that victory was better than defeat. And despite the warnings of a lot of the pundits that if you try to do this with 51 votes in the Senate, if you try to do this with a reconciliation process, instead of facing down a filibuster, that would be the nuclear option. Remember that? That faded after about a day. Nobody outside the Beltway cared about that because majority rule is something that's rather hard to argue against in a democracy, and he prevailed. And one of the best speeches he gave as president was the speech that he gave to the Democratic caucus of the House the night before the final vote, where he said, you know, when you pass this tomorrow, people are going to realize that a lot of things the Republicans have been saying about it aren't true. Death squads are not going to come and take away grandma. And people are going to realize that there are some good things in this bill. Millions of people are going to benefit because kids can stay on their parents' policies until they turn 26, and people are going to realize that it's got some good stuff in it. The problem is it doesn't have enough good stuff in it. And the compromises that he made along the way, a mandate, forcing people to buy insurance from private insurance companies that is not necessarily affordable, the fact that you're diverting Medicare to pay for it, which scares seniors silly, even though it's the so-called Medicare Advantage program, which is the privatized part of Medicare. The fact that it's not really paid for, they set the clock back so that it only starts in 2014 to make the numbers look better. It's not the world's greatest piece of reform legislation, but winning does beat losing. So people like me started saying, okay, he's had a learning curve. It's taken him 16 months. He's discovering his inner partisan. He's capable of the kind of inspirational leadership that we saw during the campaign. And then the oil spill happened. And so the odd thing about this guy is that you would have expected that hands-on management of the government might be something that he would take a little while to get up to speed on. You would not have expected that inspiring the public would be something that it would take him a while to get up to speed on. And yet, if you listen to him, he sounds flat. He doesn't sound like the guy we heard during the campaign, except in really extraordinary moments. And the progressive gods, whoever they are, have dealt a series of crises that ought to be teachable moments, Roosevelt moments. You can't let the financial industry govern itself. You can't let the oil industry govern itself. In a crisis, government has to deliver for regular people. But I think a combination of his temperament, his desire for consensus, the fact that as an African American, he has decided that he's not going to be an angry populist. He's not going to evoke the image of Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson. He's going to be cool and buttoned down. And this is not just a calculated decision. It's who he is. He's got very low blood pressure. He's not given to anger. There was a hilarious moment, not hilarious, the stakes are too high, with the press and Robert Gibbs, his press secretary, and reporters saying, has he gotten angry about the Gulf blowout? And Gibbs said, yes, he has. I've seen him get angry. Well, what did he do? Well, he clenched his jaw. What we need to hear is some outrage, some indignation directed against the oil industry on the part of the president on behalf of the American people, the fishermen, the people who live in the Gulf Coast states. And by the way, that spill is coming this way. It's only a matter of time before it hits the Gulf Stream. And this is going to be a crisis for Nantucket Sound, not just for the Gulf of Mexico. So, yes, there's a learning curve. Yes, there's a pulse. Yes, there's an opportunity. He has only begun to seize it. And the problem is that time is running out because we have this election coming up in November. And as things are going, Republicans will pick up dozens of seats in the House. They'll probably pick up 5, 6, 7, 8 seats in the Senate. And that's going to make it even harder for him to be the kind of transformational president that the moment requires. And if he fails, and again, I'm speaking not as a neutral journalist, but as a progressive, here are the stakes. An opportunity to restore a more balanced form of capitalism, a more managed economy, one where Wall Street doesn't periodically go nuts, one where the oil companies don't destroy our environment, will have been squandered. An opportunity for a political realignment where a whole generation comes of age saying, you know, government can do great things. Government got us out of the great collapse of 2007, 2009. That won't happen. And you now have a far right that is more crazy and more dangerous than any in my lifetime, where it's not simply a matter of the leadership passing to the opposition party, but the opposition party is on the verge of being captured by the Tea Party. And if you think the Tea Party is too far right to get elected, think again. Sarah Palin got put on the ticket. The governor of Virginia, although he's disguised himself as a moderate who got elected in November '09, is a far right political fundamentalist, and it has almost become a litmus test now in Republican primaries whether you were acceptable to the Tea Party wing of the Republican Party. That's happened in Florida, in Utah. Robert Bennett, very traditional, quite conservative senator, came in third in the state convention. And interestingly enough, one of his sins was to vote for the financial bailout, the TARP legislation. So it ought to be good politics to say Wall Street matters less than Main Street. We need to deliver for Main Street. It ought to be good politics to say that we're going to put people back to work. We're going to spare people the heartbreak of foreclosure, and by doing that, we're going to protect the property values of their neighbors and all the other people whose home equity is being dragged down by the epidemic of foreclosures. So there is a race between a political blowout in November and the political team around the president and the president catching on to the peril that he finds himself in. I think if the Republicans do take one house of Congress or effectively deny Obama a working majority in one House of Congress, then you'll have something reminiscent of the second part of the Clinton administration, where so-called triangulation, a Democratic president governs in coalition with the Republicans. Clinton managed to save himself. He drew a very weak opponent in Robert Dole in 96, and Obama may save himself and get reelected in 2012, depending on who his opponent is. On the other hand, he may not. And if he gets reelected by governing in coalition with a far-right Republican Party, you have to say to yourself, why bother? So I continue to be a huge fan of Barack Obama. And I wrote this book in the spirit of benevolent exasperation. I want him to succeed. But as we found out, and I'll conclude on this note, as Professor Galbraith used to say, you always have to say in conclusion to give the audience hope. I'll conclude on this note. In the Roosevelt era, in the Civil Rights era, and in the era of Lincoln, progressive presidents had movements to their left, pushing on them, doing dances with them, pressing them to seize the moment. We don't have that today. And so whether Obama succeeds is partly up to him, and it's partly up to us. Thank you so much.
Now is the time for conversation, a chance for you and for me to ask all those questions that popped into our heads while we listened to Robert Kutner. Please come up to the microphone if you have a question, and because our time is short, please limit your question or your comments to no more than a minute so that we can hear from as many people as possible. While people are getting organized, I will take the moderator's prerogative and ask you the first question. So you went through your quadrumvirate of, of Summers and Geithner, Bernanke, and Orszag. If you were going to replace those four, who would you put in?
Well, I wrote an article in September, again, before Obama was elected. I was quite confident that he was going to be elected, saying that he should have appointed Sheila Bair, head of the FDIC, to be Secretary of the Treasury. She knows how the game is played, but she has a very, very different view. Her view is, instead of propping up zombie banks, break them up. And she has been the skunk at the picnic. The old boys don't like her. I would have appointed Joseph Stiglitz as head of the National Economic Council rather than Larry Summers. There were people who were just as smart. These are supposed to be the smartest guys in the room, and we know from Vietnam that the smartest guys in the room can make catastrophic errors. And there were plenty of people, not hundreds, but certainly dozens, who were every bit as well informed, but who had different views.
Go ahead, sir.
I'm wondering, Obama is extremely intelligent after a Harvard Law Review, and he's got Emmanuel Rahm and David Axelrod there. How could they have wasted a year and change on health care? Why didn't Obama get in the Republican and Democrat House and Senate leaders on January 23rd and say, this is what I want in a health care bill, rather than, oh, come up with something? And if he'd started off and said, this is what I want it to be, as much as possible with them back then, it would have been a heck of a lot easier and less messy, I would think.
I agree with you. And I wrote in Obama's challenge, don't do health care in the first year. Get the economy fixed in the first year, and then you will have the chops to do anything you want. If you don't get the economy fixed, you won't be able to do anything else because you won't have the credibility. And Rahm Emanuel, who was a political director in the Clinton administration, drew three lessons from Clinton's failure, two of which were, I think, catastrophically wrong. One was get it done early, and the second was let Congress lead, because what Clinton did was he behaved as if he were a British prime minister. You set up the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission comes back with a blueprint, and then your majority in the House of Commons just gavels it through. That's not how our system works. So Emanuel, who was really the floor manager of this whole thing, went to the other extreme. He let Max Baucus fool around with this for months and months and months and months. He let Max Baucus pursue a bipartisan deal that was never in the cards with Grassley. And Obama's third piece of advice Emmanuel's third piece of advice to Obama was, don't try to do too much. And Obama said, no, I overrule you. I want this to be a very big deal. So, and then it ended up being a deal with the insurance companies, which wasn't such a great deal. So this was bungled in a number of ways, and I think the biggest single mistake they made was to let this suck out all the oxygen in the room, because there were so many things. I mean, we've gone without health care, all these eons. If he'd waited 2 more years and done it right, and in the meantime gotten the economy back on track, that would have been smarter politics.
In my heart of hearts, I have to feel that there are Republicans who, when they vote, know what is right, and yet that Republican Party manages to maintain iron discipline. How do they do it?
Well, the question was, how does the Republican Party maintain such iron discipline when, in fact, there are some moderate Republicans out there? First of all, if you look at the Bush, Gingrich, Cheney era, they play real hardball. There is an expression, rhino, R-I-N-O, Republican in name only. And if you are a rhino, if you commit the sin of voting occasionally with Democrats, they run primary candidates against you. They deny you your committee chairmanship if you're in the House or the Senate. And the other thing they have is they have activated ground troops taking their cue from the radio and TV talk show hosts, Limbaugh, Beck, and company. And ironically, it is the right that is on the march now. They don't represent more than 16, 18, 20% of the American public, but you can have a ton of influence if you have motivated and mobilized people who represent 1/5 of the voting public. And so moderate Republicans have pretty much been squeezed out of the Republican Party, except in some unusual places. And Massachusetts is one of them. Scott Brown was elected in part because a lot of Tea Party activists and corporate money came together, but he's been one of the few Republicans, since he wants to get reelected, who occasionally votes with the Democrats. But there are very, very few of those. There are probably, on a good day in the Senate, there are 4. Brown, the 2 senators from Maine, and George Voinovich of Ohio, who's retiring. And so the Republican Party has become a tightly disciplined ideological party, whereas the Democrats, a majority of the Democrats are progressives, but you also have so-called blue dog Democrats who are fiscal conservatives. You have the New Democrat Caucus, which are Wall Street Democrats. You don't have the kind of party discipline. You don't have the kind of hardball on the Democratic side, although I will say there are 3 very instructive cases where liberals ran opposition candidates in primaries against Democrats who were more conservative than the philosophy of the party. And that made a huge difference. Hilda Solis, the current Secretary of Labor, the child of Central American farm worker immigrants, came into politics by running a primary challenge to a very conservative Democrat in a very poor Hispanic district, and she won. One of the bright stars of the Democratic Party in Congress right now is a woman named Donna Edwards, Prince George's County, Maryland, African-American district, ran a successful primary challenge against an incumbent who voted with big business. And interestingly, right now in Arkansas, Blanche Lincoln, who had been one of the most conservative Democrats from a very poor state, had a primary opponent, the Lieutenant Governor, Bill Halter, who's a populist, running a challenge against her. And all of a sudden, she got religion on financial reform, and Blanche Lincoln became the champion of derivatives regulation. So sometimes our side, and I speak as a progressive Democrat, needs to play hardball too.
Thank you. Hi, thank you. I really thought you brought up a lot of good points about how Obama really could have used his government as an agent for true transformation. My mother's one of those people that likes to watch Glenn Beck. Now, I love my mother, but I'll have discussions with her often, and she'll tell me about how this man is turning this country into a socialist nation. So it's interesting.
If only.
Well, it's interesting how you bring up these points. So, I mean, I think this hard right has been so effective in really turning this person into such a socialist person or agendas that are so socialistic. At the same time, he's really done so little in the sense of what he really could have utilized government for. But I think Obama sees himself as a pragmatist, and the hard right sees him as more of an ideologue. But you're saying that he really needs to have some true convictions to really move things forward. Where do you think his true convictions are, or where do you think he really could move them towards?
It's a very good question. I think his whole life, and you said it very well, has been that of a principled pragmatist. I think he's a decent, honorable man with some ideals for the Republic who is convinced that there are areas of common ground, and he keeps banging his head against that stone wall because there's not a heck of a lot of common ground with Glenn Beck. I think it was Einstein who defined insanity as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Now, this is not to say that Obama is insane, but at some point you realize that this is a fool's errand. So it would be so much more effective if he were to use the financial blowout and the oil blowout as opportunities to make the case for effective government. That's, what does the Democratic Party stand for? If it doesn't stand for that, if it doesn't stand for the idea that you need things like Social Security and Medicare, regulation of banking, regulation of the oil industry to compensate for things that markets either can't do or do badly or do perversely, why bother to have a Democratic Party? And interestingly enough, he had one of the 2 or 3 most liberal voting records in the Senate. So there was reason to believe that he would be a progressive president. But I think those impulses are at war with his deeply felt impulse to be a conciliator. James McGregor Burns, the great political scientist, makes the distinction between transformational presidents and transactional presidents. And up until now, Obama has been mostly a transactional president. So I guess my hope is that he will realize not just that it's the right thing to do if you're a progressive, but that his political success as a president depends on his being a more effective and a more principled progressive because the moment demands it.
Hi. I used to be a moderate Republican until it became an oxymoron. But in any event, my question is, we talk about regulations, and yet we have a lot of regulatory agencies, like you look at the SEC, you look at the MMA. These organizations, basically they regulate, but yet they're useless. The SEC couldn't catch Madoff, even though they were given a roadmap as to exactly what he was doing. And I think that they're too bogged down in the in the paperwork to see the overall picture. Why can't regulations or rules be set up saying, okay, if you want to invest in an exotic type of, let's say, financial instrument, that if it goes bad, not only will the company pay for it, but the executives of the company will be personally liable and perhaps even criminally liable if it goes that far. And this way, when somebody says, okay, we're going to put out this exotic instrument, they're going to stop and think, well, gee, if this goes wrong, we can have a lot of trouble, and they would be a lot more careful in how they handle it.
Right. Well, you and I and a few other smart people in this room in about a half hour could design a regulatory schema that would neither interfere with entrepreneurs doing their jobs, nor would allow the kind of reckless speculation that you're talking about. The problem is political, and the problem is political in several different ways. First of all, regulatory agencies are very vulnerable to capture because the stakes are so incredibly high. So if you are the securities industry, you invest a lot of money making sure that the SEC is underfunded, making sure that tame people who are friendly to your industry, who come from your industry, get appointed to the SEC. You do the same thing with the Interior Department. This happens under both Republican and Democratic administrations. Now, what's the cure for that? I think there are a couple of cures. One has to do with how you structure regulation. You need bright lines. You need regulations that are very difficult for regulators to fudge. And the Glass-Steagall Act, whatever its deficiencies, was a bright line. You are either an investment bank and you can do whatever the heck you want, and if you lose the money, it's your money, or you're a commercial bank. And then you operate under all kinds of regulatory strictures. There are things you simply can't invest in, period, end of argument. And then if you go bad, well, the depositors will be protected, but the shareholders won't. The executives won't. When Sheila Bair at the FDIC takes a failed commercial bank into receivership, the shareholders lose everything. The bondholders take a huge hit, the executives lose their jobs, and the bank is either shut down or it's merged into a healthy bank or it's sold off to somebody else. So I think you need regulations that have bright lines on what's permitted and what's not, and then you need a more robust politics where Democrats are a progressive party. They're not a party that's half a progressive party and half a second Wall Street party. And you need more countervailing institutions like the labor movement of the sort that can bring enough clout and bring enough sophistication that when you have a hearing about some of the technical issues of securities regulation, you don't only have the regulated industry in the room. You have the academic experts, but you also have people representing consumer groups, labor groups. For the first time, there's a wonderful group called Americans for Financial Reform that is a coalition of 250 consumer and citizens and labor groups that have actually contested this legislative effort, and they are outfunded about 200 to 1 by the financial lobbies, but they're strong enough to field witnesses, to do head counts, to get in touch with their memberships, and the financial reform bill has gotten better as it's worked its way through the Senate because the public is starting to understand the stakes, because Americans for Financial Reform are there contesting the financial lobbies, and the administration has started playing a constructive role, although I think the heroes of this are more progressive members of the Senate than they are Tim Geithner and Larry Summers. Hi.
Hi. I have a suggestion for the oil companies. Slogan would be "Oil's well that ends well."
Yeah.
And my question is about the Obama's promise during the campaign to end the Iraq War. We still have 93,000 soldiers there. We're spending $10 billion a month in Iraq. We have increased the military defense budget, and then he claims he's going to freeze the budget, but not the military budget itself. So couldn't we save some of this deficit by cutting the military budget, which is bloated beyond belief?
Yeah, we could, and we should. I'm not an expert on the military. I have strong views as a citizen. I don't think we should have ever gone into Iraq. I think we could be phasing out of Afghanistan with a stronger troop commitment. But I will say this. The foreign policy piece is really hard. The reason that you don't have a movement, a mass movement comparable to the one that we had against the Vietnam War, is that it's not as cut and dried. And you look at the Taliban, you look at the way the Taliban treated women, you look at terrorism. What to do about Afghanistan is a little trickier than what my generation said we should have done about Vietnam, which was just get out. And the irony is, of course, that 45 years later, we've got a communist regime in Hanoi, and we got American multinational corporations happily producing there, and we're at peace with the Vietnamese. And there's no domino effect because communism has fallen, except in China, where it's turned into state capitalism and it's eating our lunch as an economy. But I think the Middle East is particularly difficult because I think unilateral withdrawal brings with it its own kinds of perils. I think Israel-Palestine is also really tricky. We could say to the Israelis, guys, you can't do this anymore, or you're going to lose the support of the United States. That would precipitate a radical change in policy. It would precipitate a crisis. Maybe it would end well, and we'd have better relations with the Arab states going forward. But this is very complicated stuff, and Obama faced a pressure campaign by the generals, McChrystal in particular, to put 80,000, 100,000 troops into Afghanistan. Biden argued that, you could do it with a very small transitional force. McChrystal really humiliated Obama by going public. If this had been Harry Truman would have fired him. If this had been Joe Biden would have fired him. And instead, Obama very characteristically split the difference. He said, okay, I'm not going to give you 80,000 troops. I'm going to give you, 40? And there's going to be a strict, hard time limit of 18 months. I just don't believe that. I think if the situation 18 months from now is the same as it is now, we're going to be pulled into a longer-term commitment. So I'm disappointed as you are. I think in a funny way, fixing Wall Street and moving away from oil as a source of energy is actually easier as a matter of knowing what the right thing is to do. The politics are very, very hard. But I think in the case of the Middle East, not only are the politics hard, but the policy is hard too.
All right, thank you very much.
I'm just going to jump in quickly to say these are the last two questions we'll be able to take because we're running out of time.
That's perfect, and there are only two folks lined up.
Yeah, this isn't what I was going to ask, but I was so upset at your last remarks. I feel you're not taking a progressive position on foreign policy by saying it's complicated. Of course, all the issues are complicated. That's why we're supposed to take a stand on them. We can't be running the world. It's part and parcel of the whole. That's what Wall Street does, and they've got an armed force that does it for them. And we've got to go to a more multilateral foreign policy.
Oh, I totally agree with you.
A more collective security type of a foreign policy. Yep. And just like Obama is empowering Wall Street in the financial system, he's empowering this view of foreign policy. But what I really wanted to talk about was, to put it politically, I feel that you need to sharpen. There really has to be a split between the progressives and the Wall Street wing of the Democratic Party. It's not just Obama. I agree with much of what you've analyzed there, but I don't think all those Democrats in Congress are progressives, like you said. They might have some progressive instincts and so on, but it's our job to sort that out. And they should be fighting. They should be fighting on Afghanistan. They should be fighting on the Wall Street reform. They should have fought for single payer. And it's not just a matter of personalities, and I was concerned that she asked for 4 names and you only gave 2, and that shows that, I know you can, but this stuff isn't clear to people, and Obama's base is more progressive than he is, and we knew that going in, and yet we chose to follow him, and the Democrats still won't break with those Wall Street policies because they think Obama's their only hope, and he can't be their only hope, because the Tea Party will get the working class vote and will get the Main Street vote if the Democrats are the party of Wall Street.
I couldn't agree more, and I think I did not say, maybe I misunderstood you, that all the Democrats in Congress are progressives. I think maybe 60% are, and some of them are absolute scoundrels, even though they have a D by their name. Just on foreign policy for one more minute. I agree with about 90% of what you're saying. I mean, Iraq was a catastrophe. We never should have gone in. Afghanistan, I think like a number of progressives, particularly on the treatment of women, particularly on the way the Taliban runs the society, I've got complicated feelings on that, but I totally agree that we have to multilateralize it. And the problem is there aren't a lot of other nations that want to get involved in this. There's an idea of trying to get the more moderate Middle Eastern nations to play a stabilizing role in there. I think that's a reasonable idea. But this is really hard stuff. I think your basic point that we can't police the world, absolutely right. And we could be cutting a ton of money from military spending, absolutely right too. So my mother once said, don't talk about stuff that you're not expert on. So I don't include foreign policy as part of this analysis, but I think your points are all well taken.
Mine is a foreign policy question too. What kind of success do you think you'll have with a 2-state solution and also with keeping Iran non-nuclear war?
Yeah. Well, that's another really tough one. you know, we have all these nuclear weapons, as does Russia, as does Britain. Israel has a bunch of them, and yet we have this policy, do as I say, not as I do. And there's a split among the experts as to whether a conciliatory policy towards Iran would result in a détente, or whether the regime, which is fairly crazy, would just take advantage. And again, this is not something I'm expert on. I think on the two-state solution, I fear that Israel is headed for tragedy. I think the regime there gets more and more nationalistic. There was a brilliant piece in the New York Review of Books by Peter Barnard. This was before the latest episode of the interception of the ship, where Barnard said, if the leaders of the American Jewish mainstream groups don't draw the line at the inhumanitarian stuff going on in Gaza every day, if they don't draw the line at settlements taking over land of Palestinian people, where would they draw the line? Where would they be willing to criticize Israel? And now we've had the seizure of the ship, same story. They've called for an investigation. They haven't said this was wrong. And I think as Israel becomes more and more hard line, even if a two-state solution is possible in principle, Israeli politics, Israeli internal politics won't permit it. And demographics won't permit it. I mean, you've now got people who are part of the coalition government calling for a policy of expulsion of Arab Israelis, people who are Israeli citizens but who are Arab. And so I think it would take an act of heroic, courageous intervention by the United States to essentially force a two-state solution on an Israeli government. And I think a president named Barack Hussein Obama, who is very anxious not to offend allies of Israel who were voters in the United States, is just not going to do that. He's already gotten himself into difficulty by taking a very slightly firmer line with the Israelis than the Bush administration or the Clinton administration did. So I'm not smart enough to figure out a solution to the tragedy in the making in Israel-Palestine. And, you know, if you want to cut Obama some slack, you can point out all of the things that he's been called to deal with that are very, very, very hard, not just his politics, but his policy. On the other hand, what Roosevelt had to deal with was hard. What Lincoln had to deal with was hard. Redeeming the promise of Lincoln under Lyndon Johnson was hard. And great presidents rise to the occasion, or they turn out to be failed presidents. And I think that's the sum and substance of the message. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending today. A Presidency in Peril is for sale as you exit, and Mr. Kutner is going to remain to sign books. We hope you enjoyed this inaugural breakfast at the Ford Hall Forum, and if you did, that you'll seriously consider joining the forum today as a member on your way out, and that you'll also check out our website to see what we're going to offer in the fall. Thanks very much. Good morning. Oh, it's good. Quick poll. Did people like this breakfast event? Would you like to see more of them?
There you go. Thanks very much.
It's a lot of fun. Well, I'm going to pick up the
This preceding program was brought to you by Suffolk University. Please visit us on the web at www.suffolk.edu.